Hey everyone, welcome to Daily Revelations. So what is your mantra? We all have one. Maybe you don't know that you have one because it just cycles through your head and it's something you say to yourself without even knowing it. When I was dealing with depression, that was something that took over my life because I believed all these lies and I cycled them and allowed myself to just believe them, and to the point where I didn't even realize I was thinking these things. And it became my life mantra that I was no good, that my life was no good, that all of these things that I was having to face were too difficult, too challenging, too overbearing. And a lot of people get into that cycle. That's what depression basically is. It's this downward spiral of thoughts, and there feels like there's no way out. Well, today I want to share with you from Nehemiah. And we're going to kind of cover chapters 1 through 8, but not really, because I just want to pull out the character of Nehemiah and how he lived a different mantra and how his life followed just God's blessing because of the mantra that he chose to live by. And I'll share the verse with you at the very end in chapter 8. He says, "Do not be grieved. The joy of the Lord is your strength." And he lived this out throughout all of the first 8 books, and probably after. I haven't got there yet, and I've read a while ago, but haven't studied them recently. So, but I just want to take you through some of the circumstances where he let this mantra take over, this truth overtake the lies of the world, so that he could move past them as they were obstacles. But really, what God was looking at, they were not obstacles. But from a human perspective, they seemed like huge obstacles. And he chose to trust in the joy of the Lord to be his strength over these circumstances. And it's a good lesson for all of us to look at and say, I can do the same thing. I can choose joy. I can choose truth instead of choosing the lies that I'm cycling around and around and around, or the ones that the world is throwing at me and saying, this is the truth, believe it, instead of what God tells us is true. So what does Nehemiah do? Well, Nehemiah starts out. He hears a report of how the wall in Jerusalem is broken down. What does he do? Well, he goes before the Lord and he grieves. He confesses for his people and he says, we have not done what we're supposed to do. And yet he chose joy instead of the current circumstances. He chose to trust in the Lord in faith that there was something better coming. Instead of wallowing in that, he sought God and he pursued him until God gave him a plan. But then again, the next circumstance could have stopped anyone. He was the cupbearer for the king. That means he presented the king his wine, and he stood there while the king drank it, filled it. He was there in his presence. And God told him he needed to make a request there. Well, making a request before the king when you weren't given permission could be punishable by death. And so he had a very big thing ahead of him, but he chose the joy of the Lord instead of fear of man. And he presented his request to the king, and the king granted it because God was on his side. So next thing, now he's got this huge project, and who's going to build the wall? He can't do it himself. And so he trusted. Again, he didn't just cower down in fear and say, well, this is just too big of a job for me. Instead, he chose the joy of the Lord. I'm going to just be joyful in God and trust he will provide the people and whatever supplies that I need. And the king granted him supplies as well in his request, but that everything will be what's needed. And that happened. Well, and then there were other people that weren't so keen on him building the wall, and they started spreading lies about him. and wanting to deface his character, and trying to trick him, and sending false prophets to tell him things. And yet, instead of living in fear from what these other people were saying, what they were doing, thinking they're going to win and take over, he chose again the joy of the Lord. And he trusted that God was going to tell him who he could trust and who he couldn't, and he moved on. And because of these things, at one point he says, if I were to be fearful and then act out in that fear, I would choose sin. That is exactly what happens when we don't follow faith. Instead, we follow fear. It will always lead us to act in sin, because it's a reaction of something that is stirring us to forget about God and forget about faith. Yet, in faith, we rely on truth. That means we don't rely on what we see, we rely in what God tells us is true. And then we live out God's will. And Nehemiah's life has been stepping like this now, as he has chosen the joy of the Lord over that. I heard a message yesterday, I think it was in the car, and just a brief thing on the radio. They said, if we find that we are joyful and grateful before we see the results, that's truly what faith is. And this is where Nehemiah shows us that example over and over again, is that he chose to be faithful when circumstances and people around him and all these other things, they were attacking the wall. They were working with one hand, had a spear or a sword in the other, and they were working as fast as they could. They still finished it in 52 days. Because God was on his side, and he chose not to give in to the fear. He chose to stay strong in what God had told him to do and how to do it. So he lived out the victory before the victory had come. And that's how we have to live out our lives. That's where the joy comes from. We live in victory before we see the product, because we know the product and we trust that it's going to be there. So, but then, having lived this, he had to teach it to the people. This cupbearer became the governor of this province because he chose to trust God, and people saw that God was working in his life. And so he had Ezra come out. Ezra had been sent, and I shared about Ezra yesterday. Ezra had been sent years before to rebuild the temple. And he was a scribe, and he was a priest, and he read out of the book of Moses to the people. And when they heard it, they were grieved to the heart, and they said, we have failed. And they started fearing again. And Nehemiah looked at this and he said, wait. These are things that have happened in the past. And this is something that we need to look at too, because oftentimes we will look at what has happened in the past that we have done probably out of just not knowing or out of fear, and we want to beat ourselves up about all these things that we've done. And Nehemiah told the people, no, you need to leave that. Leave it with God. The joy of the Lord is your strength. And that's where this verse comes in, when he's telling the people, do not be grieved. The joy of the Lord is your strength. Be still. This day is holy. Do not be grieved. We can't redo the past. The only thing we can do is move forward into the future. And maybe the future doesn't look so great, but God is in the future, and God has a plan. And we need to stay in this bubble of faith, in this bubble of joy, because God wins. And if we have faith, we truly believe that. And we have to live in that strength today, tomorrow, and the next day, as God moves us through whatever he has us going through. So what is your mantra? Is your mantra, I'm fearful about this circumstance, and I'm worried about this person, or how this is going to affect the rest of my life, and how all of this stuff is going? Or is your mantra, I choose joy. And I choose that joy today, tomorrow, and the next day, because the joy of the Lord is my strength, and that God will work this all out for good. I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, to prosper you, to bring you peace. And that's what we have to trust in. So thanks for joining me today on Daily Revelations. I'll see you in a couple days. Tomorrow I have my biblical theology class, so I will not be on, but I'll be back. After that, who knows what I'll have to share, but I'll see you then. Bye.